The Battle of Restigouche was a naval battle fought during the French and Indian War on the Restigouche River between the British Royal Navy and the small flotilla of vessels of the French Navy, Acadian militia and MIKMAQ militias. The French vessels had been sent to relieve New France after the fall of Quebec. Supplies were extraordinarily important because France ran their colonies such that the colonies were wholly dependent on products and manufacturing of the motherland. The loss of the Battle of Restigouche and the consequent inability to supply the troops marked the end of any serious attempt by France to keep hold of their colonies in North America, and it severely curtailed any hopes for a lengthy resistance to the British by the French forces that remained. The battle was the last major engagement of the MIKMAQ and Acadian militias before the burying of the hatchet ceremony between the MIKMAQ and the British. Background: Quebec had fallen to the British in September 1759, but French forces still remained in New France in large numbers. Several appeals to the French government for reinforcements met with indifference or neglect, partly because the French Navy had been smashed at the Battle of Quiberon Bay in November 1759. On April 10, 1760, the frigate Le Maquot under Lieutenant François La Girardet sailed from Bordeaux with 5 merchant ships carrying 2,000 casks of provisions and 400 troops. François Gabriel d'Angier commanded reinforcement troops because of his familiarity with the area. Things did not go well for the flotilla on the outward journey. On April 11, they were forced to disperse in order to run the British blockade off France. 2 merchant vessels were seized, and 2 weeks later another ran aground in the Azores. The 3 remaining vessels rendezvoused in the Gulf of St. Lawrence on May 15, only to find that a British fleet had already arrived in Quebec, seeking a safe harbour. They sailed for Chaleur Bay and anchored in the estuary of the Restigouche River near the MIKMAQ settlement of Lescallier on May 18. Here they enlisted the help of the locals and some Acadian refugees in exchange for feeding and arming them. In the meantime, a force of Royal Navy ships under Captain John Byron sailed from Louisbourg to intercept the French flotilla. They arrived in Chaleur Bay on June 22, blockading any attempt by La Girardet to escape. He responded by sailing further upriver where the deeper draft British ships would have difficulty following. There he turned Le Maquot broadside, scuttled some schooners as a barrier and placed a battery of cannon ashore to strengthen his position. On the 26th of October, 1759, after the fall of Quebec, the French priests who had been an integral part of the leadership of the Acadian militia and MIKMAQ militia began to negotiate for peace. Father Monac accepted in the name of the Acadians at Richeboucteau and Baie Wines the peace proposals put forward by Commandant Henry Alexander Schomburg. Father Maillard and Joseph Charles Germain also agreed to local capitulations. These initiatives were severely criticized by French officer at Restigouche Jean-François Bourdon de Domburg. He prepared a file on the missionaries, whom he accused of treason. The Battle of Restigouche was one of the few battles the Acadians and MIKMAQ undertook without the sanction of the French priests. The battle, an Acadian militia and MIKMAQ militia, totaling 1,500 fighters, organized in the Battle of Restigouche. The Acadians arrived in about 20 schooners and small boats. Along with the French, they continued upriver to draw the British fleet closer to the Acadian community of Pointe-à-la Batterie, where they were ready to launch a surprise attack on the English. The Acadians sunk a number of their vessels to create a blockade, upon which the Acadian and MIKMAQ fired at the ships. On the 27th of June, the British succeeded in maneuvering just beyond the chain of sunken ships. Once the British were range of the battery, they fired on the battery. This skirmish lasted all night and was repeated with various breaks from the 28th of June to the 3rd of July, when the British overwhelmed Pointe-à-la Batterie, burning 150 to 200 buildings which made up the Acadian village community at Pointe-à-la Batterie. The militias retreated and regrouped with the Mako. They sunk more schooners to create another blockade. They created 2 new batteries, one on the north shore at Point de la Mission, and one on the south shore at Point aux Sauvages. They created blockade with schooners at Point aux Sauvages. On the 7th of July, Byron spent the day getting rid of the battery at Point aux Sauvages and later returned to the task of destroying Le Mako. By the morning of the 8th of July, Scarborough and Repulse were in range of the blockade and face-to-face with Le Mako. The British made 2 attempts to defeat the batteries and the militias held out. On the third attempt, they were successful. Despite La Giraudet's positioning, Byron was able to negotiate the shallower waters and on the 3rd of July, confronted the French defensive line. At close range and in calm winds, the battle commenced. Despite being outgunned, the French inflicted heavy damage on the British before Byron succeeded in silencing the shore batteries. Le Mako and the merchant ships Bienfaisant and Marquis de Malors then withdrew further upriver with the British in pursuit. For the next several days the 2 forces engaged in a running battle, but La Giraudais recognized that he could not win a battle of attrition, and on the 8th of July he had Le Mako and Bienfaisant scuttled to prevent the capture of their cargo. The remaining French force then withdrew to the shore and the safety of Lestigouche while Byron returned to Louisbourg. Aftermath. The Battle of the Restigouche ended with all the French ships and most of the Acadians' boats sunk. But the English were not successful in landing because of the number of muskets on shore. The Acadian militia and MIKMAQ had made their last stand here and survived. Their resistance was in effect a success. The loss of important provisions hastened the fall of New France. Without outside support and surrounded by 3 separate British forces, Montreal fell on September 8. La Giraudais finally surrendered on October 29, 6 days after hearing the news of the capitulation. Byron later commanded the British fleet that was defeated at the Battle of Grenada in 1779, as well as becoming governor of Newfoundland. Legacy. Today, the site of the battle is a National Historic Site of Canada known as Battle of the Restigouche National Historic Site. An interpretive centre located in Pointe-à-la-Croix, Quebec features artifacts recovered from the site, displays and a film about the battle, and a 1/32 scale model of the 18th century frigate Le Mako. In the summer, costumed interpreters portray the Acadians, Micmac, sailors and French soldiers who participated in the 1760 battle.